You may keep your charms, Terran, Verzak Nor sneered, the council hall amplifiers throwing his voice like a hammer across the stone-lit chamber. We do not barter with those who fear their own stars. A ripple of laughter broke across the council delegates, rising like a sharp crack in dry timber. Darren Volst, standing before the grand rostrum, let the noise pass over him without a flicker. His hands moved once, closing the data slate, the sound of its magnetic seal snapping shut like a judge's gavel. Above them, banners of the Accord hung heavy, their once gold emblems tarnished to a dull, begrudging bronze by the ionized air systems. Every breath in the chamber tasted of sterilized stone and old varnish, a world preserved too long inside its own myths. Lights, too bright and white, seared down from arrays hidden behind vast geometric carvings, forcing the delegates to squint and shift uncomfortably, though none would admit it. You presume to lecture civilizations that have danced with neutron stars while your kind still feared the night, Verzak continued, curling one clawed hand for emphasis. His silver robe, layered in insignias and planetary sigils, swept wide as he moved, the hem brushing dust motes into sharp, chaotic spirals. Darren said nothing. He adjusted the cuffs of his plain envoy tunic, matte black with no ornament, and stared evenly into Verzak's burning ochre eyes. A slow whisper crawled through the gathered species, sibilant, rising, until it was a raucous wave of disdain. Even the more conservative counselors leaned back into their throne-like chairs, smirks flickering across mouths framed by scales, tusks, and plated mandibles. Somewhere, a delegation chair scraped awkwardly against the composite stone floor, screeching like a wounded bird. My proposal, Darren said finally, voice low, crisp, carrying not by amplification but by deliberate clarity, was not a request. It hung there, a nail, driven into centuries of pride. For half a heartbeat, the hall trembled with uncertain quiet. But Verzak roared back with laughter, shattering it like thin ice. He turned full circle to the counselors, his hands thrown wide, basking in the derision. Threat? He bellowed, the chords in his thick throat flexing. From a planet that still bleeds every time it reaches for the void? The hall answered with clanging feet, clicking mandibles, thudding ceremonial staffs. The sound battered the air itself, pressing down on the senses until every word was drowned beneath it. Darren stood through it all. His nostrils caught the dry antiseptic tang of the recycled atmosphere. His skin prickled under the static from the council's antiquated shield lattice, a barely thin sensation like dead grass brushing against bare ankles. Above, the old metalwork of the hall's crown creaked with thermal strain, a sound so slight it might have been the building sighing at its own decay. On the far left dais, Mekon Ras, Earth's silent diplomatic recorder, remained stone still, his reflective visor dimmed, recording everything with unblinking, passive loyalty. Darren's gaze drifted briefly to the banners overhead. Treaties forged in triumph, now faded to brittle relics. Symbols that once meant honor, now hollow brass. Verzak's voice boomed once more. Return to your dying world, Envoy Volst, carry your fears home and worship them as you see fit. Here, we command the stars. Another chorus of ugly laughter edged with something feral filled the dome. Darren moved at last. One deliberate step forward, the sound of his boot sole brushing coarse tile, sharp against the tide of noise. Then another. He paused at the threshold of the speaker's platform, where ancient runes once representing truth and unity were now worn near to invisibility. He lifted his slate, let the heads-up display flicker once for the council record, the names, the times, the words, then shut it off. A clean severance. The glow died in his palm like a fading ember. Without bow, without salute, Darren turned and walked away, the hem of his tunic stirring stagnant currents of dusty air in his wake. No haste, no hesitation, only the steady rhythm of departure, each footfall an indictment far louder than protest could have been. Behind him, Verzak's voice continued, thinner now despite its bluster, desperate to wring one final humiliation from the moment. Earth's arrogance will be their monument, he shouted after Darren's retreating form. Their tombstone written in forgotten stars. No response. None was needed. The twin gates of the grand hall stood open at the far end, guarded by honor sentries who barely concealed their disdain. As Darren approached, the heavy doors, built from the shattered hull of the First Council flagship, loomed like the maw of some ancient predator. Cold air seeped from the passage beyond, touched faintly with a metallic scent of deep-forged alloys, and something older still, the sterile, unyielding smell of stone abandoned by purpose. Darren stepped across the threshold, boots striking the metal lip with a final, ringing clarity. Behind him, the laughter faltered, for just a breath, as if some deeper current beneath the mockery had sensed its own error. The doors closed not with a clang, but a heavy, shuddering groan, sealing the council back into their echo chamber of pride. In the outer corridor, Megan Ross fell into step silently behind him. The only witness Earth would need. Darren did not look back. He allowed himself a single exhalation, slow, measured, tasting the iron bite of the recycled air as it filled his lungs. Overhead, along the grand spinal corridor of the council spire, ancient conduit lights flickered in sporadic disrepair, throwing their path into alternating patches of gold and shadow. As they descended toward the docking bays, the noise from the grand hall dwindled to a dull, mocking buzz. A hive, soon to be forgotten. "Mekon," Darren said quietly, his first words outside the hall. "Confirm the final transmission. Council rejection. Record Verzak's statement. Timestamp the exit." The recorder acknowledged with a soft, static pulse from his wrist module. No commentary. No questioning. At Bay 9, the diplomatic shuttle, the Cormand fold sat ready, silent engines humming against the berth plating, bright in the dim hangar like a promise withheld. As they boarded, Darren allowed himself a single glance at the heads-up display set into the shuttle's canopy. No threats listed, no pursuits. The council was too busy gorging itself on its own certainty. Above the great capital spires of Varantor, beyond the bleeding light of the council towers, stars shimmered coldly against the ink of space. So few of them understood what they were seeing. Darren keyed the launch sequence. Earth's patience had always been mistaken for weakness. It would not be mistaken much longer. "Bead Surinth Spectrum again," barked Senor Velk, his plated fingers rapping against the operations console. The command center of the Council's astral observatory buzzed with static tension, the heavy scent of worn composite and overheated coolant baking the stale air. Above the central pit, the laser plasma displays jittered and blurred, stitched together with urgent overlays. Gravitational flux readings, magnetic contour warps, thermal collapse markers. Technician crews bent over their stations, eyes flickering between the incoming data in their trembling hands. "No changes, High Admiral," muttered one, voice thinned by the charged atmosphere. Velk's upper lip peeled back slightly, the gesture halfway between a sneer and a grimace. The light from the tactical beams washed across his bronze skin, casting fractured shadows under his brow ridges. Rannick Solvar stood to the side, hands loosely folded behind him, expression unreadable. Earth's chief astrophysicist had been summoned to witness the anomaly, not advise. His lean frame, dressed in unadorned charcoal gray layers, seemed to drink in the frantic energy of the room without reflecting any of it. He tilted his head slightly toward the nearest heads-up telemetry feed. Numbers cascaded. Wrong. Twitching. Impossible. Star mass ratios wobbling. Core harmonics spiraling inward. A system collapsing not by force, but by a subtle unraveling, like the slow, inexorable tearing of ancient cloth. "Signal degradation confirmed across all sectors," reported the senior analyst, a stocky Zothari male whose triple eyelids fluttered nervously against the laser plasma glare. "Thorinth's surface field has inverted. External gravitational shearing imminent." Belk slammed his hand against the console, the impact sending a ripple through the nearby field screen. "It's statistical noise," he barked. "A fluctuation. A passing instability. Nothing more." Across the chamber, Brannock Solvar's lips parted just enough to breathe a single line into the quiet. Storinth has fallen. No dramatics, no crescendo, just the cold breath of an obituary. Velk turned sharply, the folds of his admiral's cloak whispering against the armored weave of his uniform. "You presume too much, Earthborn," he snapped, voice carrying a serrated edge. "One anomaly does not condemn an empire." Brannock offered no rebuttal. He merely moved to the auxiliary rail, studying the dynamic star chart blooming above the sunken observation deck. Sorinth's representation, once a proud, pulsing beacon of energy, flickered uncertainly, its golden core caving inward, tendrils of gravitational bleed lashing at its orbiting bodies. The control room's temperature seemed to drop, condensation ghosting at the edges of some of the older, less sealed paneling. Somewhere deep in the infrastructure, the vibration of failing cooling vanes gave off a low, unsettling growl, as if the building itself sensed the death far beyond its walls. "You will retract that statement from your official record," Velk said, stepping closer, the light from the displays turning the bone white of his irises into small, gleaming points. Brannock didn't even glance at him. His fingers danced lightly across the nearest manual node, bypassing the lagging automated routines. With a few deft adjustments, he expanded the sector scan, zooming out beyond Sorinth. A second star, Maros Vale, jittered on the edge of readable parameters, its brightness dimming not by its own rhythms, but by external stress. Brannock tapped the screen once, a gentle, final punctuation. "If you insist," he said, voice calm as glacial drift. "I'll retract it when the second death becomes a statistical error too." Felt bristled. His knuckles creaked audibly as he clenched his hands. "Signal an interstellar diagnostic sweep," he ordered the deck chief, voice heavy with constrained fury. "Audit gravitational vectors across sectors 17 through 25. Initiate standard stability protocols." "Yes, High Admiral," came the brittle reply. The room moved under the command, but the energy had shifted. It was no longer the frantic precision of technicians at war with random error. It was the brittle, hollow scrambling of men trying to outpace an avalanche already at their throats. Brannock folded his arms and leaned slightly against the cold rail, his gaze distant, reflective. The smell of ionizing polymers from overworked systems bit faintly at the back of the throat. The lighting in the room shifted subtly, moving toward a reddish emergency glow as power rerouted itself away from failing sectors. Above them, the Council's grand laser plasma maps, once monuments to cosmic mastery, sagged under the weight of corrupted data streams. In the observation well, the visual of Sorinth's pulse darkened further, collapsing inward. Its light, once proud, once foundational to 8 worlds and 3 mining arcs, twisted into a knot of searing gravity and screaming dust, spinning itself to nothing. Velk stared at it, unwilling to blink, as if his will alone could reverse the collapse. He muttered under his breath in an old dialect, a sailor's prayer against shipwrecks. "Hatch through to the outer arrays," he barked again. "Get me cross-spectrum verification." A younger analyst, thin, glassy-eyed, hesitated visibly before speaking. "Outer arrays? Have ceased transmission, sir." The words hung in the sterile air like ash. Velk's jaw flexed. A tremor ran down the left side of his throat ridge. "Run internal simulations," he snapped. "Override Earth sector modeling. Use Turok mass equations if necessary. Find the root." Another technician cleared his throat cautiously. "With respect, High Admiral, the models diverge after 36 standard cycles. Predictive integrity below 8%. It was the death knell of reason." Velk straightened to his full towering height, robes settling against the armored bulk of his shoulders. "Earth's proposal was rooted in fear," he said, as if trying to carve the words into the bones of the room. "They would have shackled the stars, to crawl in the dark forever." Brannock tilted his head, a sliver of something almost like pity ghosting across his face. "No," he said softly, "not for Velk, but for the dying heavens far beyond. We would have taught you to listen." Across the chamber, The warning klaxons began to pulse, not in alarms of battle, but in the ancient, solemn tones once reserved for a system's dying call to its makers. Above them, Sorinth's pulse vanished from the Council's main cartographic lattice, one less star etched against the endless silence. And somewhere in the gulf beyond human sight, the tide began to turn. "Initiate cross-sector sweeps," Senor Velk snapped, his voice slicing through the thick static of the failing command deck. "Full gravitational audits, no delays, move." The atmosphere inside the Grand Astral Observatory had shifted from grim defiance to barely contained panic. Screens jittered, emergency overlays bleeding crimson and amber across laser plasma displays. Console lights throbbed under the sudden stress, casting sickly pulses over the operators' sweating faces. The death of Sorinth's pulse had shattered the illusion of control. Now another star, Vecran's beacon, blinked erratically across the readings, its core warping under unseen strain. A junior analyst, skin blotched from stress, whispered too loudly, "Sector 17 destabilizing, secondary mass divergence confirmed." Belk spun toward the central platform, his command boots grinding against the roughened alloy floor. He gritted his teeth, the taste of recycled mineral air thick on his tongue, catching at the back of his throat like powdered rust. "Emergency channel Delta 9, he barked at the comms officer. "Notify all fleets. Strategic reinforcement to critical stellar hubs." The officer tried, fingers dancing over the cracked surface of a responsive pad, but lines of jagged interference flooded the main heads-up. No clean signals, no confirmations. Across the galaxy's mapped arms, the stars seemed to shudder. Far from the crumbling grandeur of the Council chambers, aboard Earth's orbital relay array, Darren Vull stood with arms crossed behind his back, his figure framed against the sweeping curvature of Earth's stationed observatory wall. The heads-up displays hovered before him, quietly alive with unsparing truths. Thermal decay models, gravitational snap projections, cascade probabilities. Darren said nothing. He watched Vecran's collapse unfold through a storm of slash data feeds and ripple-spread gravitational warning. The station smelled of cold polymers and the lingering mineral tang of old spacefaring metals. Overhead, stabilizer coils vibrated faintly against the tension of interwoven fields, threading a low, almost imperceptible hum into the bones of the deck. Beside him, Commander Yelric Dorn shifted uneasily, the starch-stiff collar of his gray uniform creaking. His eyes, sharper than most, flickered across the unfolding catastrophe without speaking the obvious. Darren finally broke the silence with a murmur, almost to himself. The river breaks where the stones refuse to listen. No orders were given, no action needed. Earth's patience was already written into the collapsing heavens. Across the Council's frontier sectors, chaos burst like silent flares. Dispatch relays blinked and stuttered across failing heads-up hubs. In the Devran outpost, a senior technician hurled his headset across the comms pit, as connection after connection died screaming into static. On Tovrek 5's orbital ring, a sensor officer wiped cold sweat from his brow, staring at an impossible reading, a sun, once steady, bending its own axis. Fractures spidered through supply networks, through orbital stations, through colonies whose lifelines depended on stellar stability. Entire agriculture zones plunged into erratic day-night cycles as suns dimmed or flared without pattern. Everywhere, emergency beacons clawed into the void, and everywhere, no help came. At the Grand Council Assembly, the main display domes rattled with discordant alarm tones. Workplan shoved aside ceremonial protocols, his thick hands slamming the request terminal. "We need full mobilization, fleet engineers, crisis stabilization units, solar suppression cores." "Deploy suppression fleets to where?" Karnath Salk demanded, rising from his curved seat, voice tight with barely contained fury. "The map's collapsing faster than the reports can update." Screens bled inaccuracies. By the time a star's health scan posted, it was already wrong. Belk's voice roared over the assembly, refusing surrender. "Containment protocols must hold. The stars are our dominion." The hall vibrated under the weight of failing belief. A rhythm, deep and foreboding, threaded through every motion, every rushed command, every snarled accusation. An engineer from the 3rd Scientific Division staggered into the chamber's lower threshold, face slack with terror. "It's not a natural cascade," he gasped. Something is triggered." The council fell deathly still, the only sound the rattling breath of men too proud to understand they were already losing. In Terran command, Darren watched the next event unfold. Cerinthia's Verge, a lesser star but critical for trade routes, sheared itself into a dust spiral, its orbitals shredded into plasma mist. The Terran relay platforms recorded the death in silence, adjusting no courses, making no announcements. Earth's policy had been enacted long ago. Darren's gloved fingers tapped once against the control pad, bringing up a comparative survey. Before and after 2 frames frozen only hours apart. Where once blazed proud beacons across the mapped skies, voids now gaped, swallowing ships, colonies, hope. Yelric Dorn's voice, low and even, barely touched the charged air. "Council sectors 4, 5, and part of 6, gone to black. Record it." Duran answered. His voice was not cold. It was ancient. The tone of a man whose warnings had become prophecies too late. Above them, the starfield display quietly dimmed 3 more notches. Back in the Grand Assembly, discord turned to near violence. Debates became roars, treaties ripped from golden frames, declarations of emergency piled into the airwaves like panicked birds too stupid to find open sky. Senor Velkface, once carved from granite certainty, now showed cracks. The barely veiled terror behind his proclamations, the hollow ring of his demands. He struck the command altar, sending ceremonial glyphs scattering across the stonework. "We are not undone by Terran fears," he bellowed. No one answered him, because outside the assembly walls, in the naked arenas of the stars themselves, the Council's great works, their fleets, their worlds, their pride, trembled on the brink of extinction. And Earth? Earth said nothing. Vecran's beacon flared once on the outermost array scans, twisted into something thin, bright, and wrong, and then collapsed inward, like a closing hand crushing unseen bones. The observatory's main screen surged with error flags, error loops, system failures. Entire sectors blinked off the network with the quiet finality of candles snuffed in a rising gale. Across the command halls of countless council worlds, emergency sirens screamed, not the shrill clarion of war, but the hollow tolling bells of old abandoned temples. Senor Velk staggered against the council altar, one hand pressed to the cool stone for balance. His breathing came harsh now, raw against the stifling air. "Mobilize everything," he rasped, to no one in particular. "Mobilize or die." But the systems they had built, the stars they had thought eternal, no longer listened. And far beyond, where Earth's silent stations recorded each darkening beacon with sterile thoroughness, Duran Volst closed another entry into the archive. Without anger, without pity, because those who laughed at warnings had no claim to rest, only to history. "Initiate covert retrieval," Drev Thrakal hissed, leaning over the conference dais where shadows bled across the ancient war room's stone inlays. "Earth's schematics exist, somewhere. We tear the roots from the soil if needed." 12 senior strategists, cloaked in the muted steel moople garb of the Council's clandestine division, circled the table. The stale musk of dust-caked insulation mixed with the sharper tang of ionized conduits, threading the chamber with the sour scent of abandonment. Above them, a battered heads-up projection flickered. Sketches of Earth's compression lattice schematics rotated in jagged intervals, incomplete and distorted from the stolen diplomatic archives. The images shimmered with ghosting errors, segments redacted, calibration margins blurred as though resisting theft by design. Senor Velk's envoy, a skeletal officer named Kraylin Vor, shifted his weight uneasily. "Unauthorized acquisition risks triggering..." Drakel's hand slammed down, rattling a cracked water vial onto the floor. "The risk is irrelevance," he spat. "Without corrective action, We are a footnote before the cycle turns. Murmurs rippled across the table, low and fractious, like fire chewing through dry grass. No unity remained among the council's inner echelons. Only desperate splinters groping toward salvation. They did not understand. A new file pulsed to life across the heads-up. Internal maps. Deep space black sites buried under abandoned council outposts. Research stations designed for forbidden work. Relics of a more savage era. Trickle's finger stabbed toward the largest of them. Xeron Vault, lost after the Third Drift rebellions. Still intact. Still operational. A grim nod passed around the assembly. 3 cycles later, under an artificial sky flickering like a sick beast, a black courier transport skimmed across Zaren's shattered plateau. Its hull carried no markings, its plasma exhaust muted to a whisper against the frayed strata. Inside the vault, dust hung in the stale air like the last breath of a dying god. Crates of forbidden tech lay abandoned, their safeguards long corroded into irrelevance. Flashes of cracked containment glass caught the stuttering lights, casting fractured prisms across the cracked floors. Drav Thrakel and his core team descended through the shattered elevator spine, mag clamps on their boots gripping warped decking. Their breath misted inside rebreathers. The vault's atmosphere had long since turned caustic. "This is where it begins," Thrakel murmured as they entered the central chamber, the compression chamber. In the dim confines they found a Terran prototype, ancient and battered, left by some forgotten warfront negotiation centuries past. Beneath layers of decay and cobwebbed alloy, its skeleton hummed with dormant gravity resonance fields, waiting for hands foolish enough to wake it. Trakal leaned close, voice ragged with triumph. Earth buried its secrets in sight, thinking we would never see. The others dared not speak. They moved to the calibration stations, fingers trembling slightly as they initiated illicit taps into the ancient machine's latticework. From deep within the artifact, lights pulsed, not welcoming, but warning. Back at the Grand Assembly, Velk brooded over fragmentary reports, his hands flexing over the command table as if trying to wring clarity from chaos. Auric Plen entered with heavy steps, coat splattered with chemical residue from failed containment simulations. "They've found something," Auric said, voice low, weighted. "Threk's team is attempting stabilization field seeding." Velk turned slowly. "And?" Auric shook his head. "Too soon to tell." "Tell them to accelerate," Velk growled. "If Earth withheld salvation from the galaxy, it must be seized. Their knowledge must serve us." Outside, another series of alerts trembled through the station's hard lines, minor star anomalies radiating outward from the initial sectors. The skies themselves seemed to ripple under strain. Deep within Xeron Vault, the experiment began. Bruckel's scientists, encased in adaptive suits barely functional after centuries of neglect, worked feverishly, cross-wiring Terran systems to Council Core stabilizers. The lattice ignition array stuttered once, then again, then roared to uneven life, filling the chamber with teeth-rattling vibrations. Monitors jittered. Unreadable graviton fields surged across instruments not designed for such raw distortions. Colors bled from the walls, reds turning into sickly blues, yellows fracturing into shrieking violet bands. One engineer stumbled back from his post, blood seeping from his ears. "Core harmonics destabilizing," he screamed into the comms. Trakal ignored him, his gaze fixed on the central compression lattice, a network of containment nodes now spinning too fast to track. It looked like a spiderweb, trying to contain a hurricane. A warning klaxon split the chamber, shedding dust from the crumbling vault ceiling. The auxiliary heads-up feed flickered to a sector map. A minor star, Vintar's Hope, once deemed stable, now spiraling into catastrophic flux. The timing was not coincidence. They had done this. At Terran High Command, Darren Volst leaned forward, watching Vintar's degradation cascade across the laser plasma displays. The star's gravitational integrity wobbled, collapsed inward, then burst into debris streams that shredded its orbiting moons. Commander Yelric Dorn stood beside him, jaw tightening as the data fed through predictive collapse models. They tried to reverse the compression lattice, Dorn said finally, voice low. Darren nodded once, as though acknowledging a funeral he had long seen coming, and they struck the match inside a dry forest. No orders were issued, no interventions attempted. Earth's part had ended with the offering. The aftermath belonged to nature now. Inside Zarin Vault, the consequences arrived. Vintar's explosion triggered gravitational shock waves through local subspace, buckling the fabric around the vault's coordinates. Alarms shrieked, comms blacked out, and containment seals crumbled. One by one, the stolen stabilizers tore themselves apart, their lattices fraying into wild, uncontrolled singularities. Drakal's last sight, as he scrambled toward the central archway, was the compression prototype folding in on itself, a false sun born to devour its makers. The blast wave ripped through the vault, collapsing corridors, erasing records, and silencing every breath before it could become a scream. In the Council's assembly, the news hit like a buried mine. Velk listened in stunned silence as sector collapse reports flooded the emergency channel, each accompanied by the grim staccato of confirmed system deaths. "Initiate system lockdowns," he rasped, throat raw. Karnath Salk's reply was not defiance but futility. "There are no systems left to lock." On Earth, Darren Volst keyed in the final entry for Vintar's fall. His fingers brushed the recording node lightly, as if sealing an old, half-forgotten wound, before returning to silence. The Council had stolen fire from hands that had once offered light freely, and like the oldest of myths, they were burned alive by what they could not understand. "You think silence means surrender?" Verzak Nor's snarl cracked against the stone vaults of the Grand Assembly, his voice a whip through the trembling air. "Earth hides because they know terror approaches." Delegates flinched under the weight of that lie, each instinctively glancing up at the flickering laser plasma displays that mapped the Council's territories, maps now hemorrhaging darkened systems like open wounds. The hall stank of desperation, of scorched synthetic fabric and the sourness of sweat trapped too long beneath formal armor. Emergency lights spun their crimson warnings across banners torn from their moorings, throwing slashing shadows against the once immaculate marble. Auric Plunge shoved past the ceremonial ring, the heavy iron of his council badge swinging loose against his chest. "Enough posturing," he barked, voice cutting through the chamber's brittle tension. "We need to send envoys to Earth, sue for knowledge before there's nothing left to salvage." A murmur rose, jagged and dangerous, like glass grinding beneath a boot. Eyes darted between Auric and Verzak, weighing the cost of allegiance. Karnath Salk, flanking the western seats, rose slowly. His gray robes were scorched along the hem, evidence of his narrow escape from the collapsed Kevral archives only hours before. His voice, when it came, was colder than the grave. "Negotiation does not mean surrender," Karnath said. "We stand on an altar of burning systems. Pride will not shield us from what comes next." Verzak's hands gripped the edge of the speaking dais, claws biting deep gouges into the stone. "You would crawl to Terran feet? Beg them for chains under the guise of treaties?" The insult, once a rallying cry, now hung limp in the heavy air. No reply came. Not immediately. Instead, the ancient council seals behind him, symbols of unity forged across 1,000 worlds, snapped apart with a brittle crack as the temperature regulators failed overhead. Chipped fragments of sigils rained onto the floor like dead leaves. Verzak turned, staring at the shattered emblems, his expression hollow. He faced the assembly again, voice hoarse but still sharp. "They will beg us for mercy before this ends." The lie echoed through the cavernous space, shriveling under the silence that followed. Behind closed council alcoves, whispers grew, teeth. Auric met in secret with Karnath and 6 other lesser counselors, each bearing the marks of ruined sectors, each hollow-eyed and furious. "Verzak's madness will salt what remains," Auric said, pacing the cramped, shadow-smeared chamber where the walls still bore scorch marks from the last rebellion centuries before. Karnath leaned forward, hands steepled against the cracked lacquer of the war table. "Then we make a choice," Karnath said. Open talks, quietly, outside of formal channels. The others hesitated, the scent of old, oil-drenched parchment and dying power cells heavy around them. Finally, one grizzled counselor named Vorn Drek broke the stillness. If Earth does not respond, Karnath's smile was thin. Then we die with the dignity of those who tried. Across the heads-up in the corner, another system winked out. In the assembly proper, Verzak prepared his counterstrike. He summoned the Emergency Powers Tribunal. Ancient codes buried in the Accord's core, meant for crises of invasion or planetary collapse. His enforcers. Heavy-set figures clad in reinforced robes etched with bloodlines long thought broken, moved through the halls like silent knives, eyes like frozen pits. The tribunal process was brutal. Rapid votes, forced oaths, declarations burned into the assembly ledger by direct imprint. Within 2 cycles, Verzak held dominion over council military logistics, starport clearances, and communication bottlenecks. He broadcast his decrees through the crippled network, each transmission framed by the shattered remains of the council's once proud emblem. Auric Plen moved quickly. Before the emergency powers could fully tighten their noose, he leaked classified failures from Xeron Vault, evidence that Earth's technology had been stolen and catastrophically misused. The counselors, once cowed, now roared with outrage as the hidden scandals erupted into full view. Senor Velk attempted to quell the storm, stepping onto the assembly floor with forced grandeur. His robe tails dragged scorched debris across the cracked mosaics. "We acted to preserve the council," Velk said, lifting one battered hand. "To deny us now is to deny survival itself." Stone, no more than a loose paving chunk, arced through the air and struck the speaker's dais, splintering the wood into shrapnel. The assembly shattered into open chaos. In a forgotten corridor behind the assembly vaults, Verzak confronted Auric Plen face to face. "You shame yourself," Verzak snarled, breath hot with fury. "You kneel to animals who mistake science for sorcery." Auric's reply came like a blade's thrust. "I kneel to survival, not to memory." The guards shifted uneasily, unsure which order would come, arrest or execution. Verzak's hand twitched toward his wrist module, but froze. Even now he understood. Force would only expose how much he had already lost. Without another word, he turned and stalked back toward the Grand Assembly, a king striding proudly into a crumbling throne room. Behind him, Auric Plen's voice rang out, low and final. "History does not remember the loudest cry, Verzak. It remembers the last one." Outside the council citadel, riots bloomed like ulcers across the satellite cities. Street processions, once orderly parades of allegiance, now churned into mobs. Fires burned where banners had once fluttered. The smell of scorched polymer cables and shattered ferrocrete walls clung to the gusting streets. Old treaties were ripped down by angry hands, statues were defaced with streaks of ash and ground stone. The council, once a symbol of undying unity, fractured irreparably along invisible fault lines that had been growing for centuries, merely waiting for the weight of one mistake too large to bear. In the darkness of Terran Command's observation tower, Darren Volst watched the fallout without a flicker of satisfaction. He recorded nothing. There was no need. The council was collapsing under forces more ancient than hatred, entropy, pride, fear, all wearing different banners but marching the same road. He pressed a hand lightly against the reinforced viewport, feeling the cold seep into his bones. "Dully pair their own routes," Yelric Dorn said behind him, voice low. "They were given the map," Darren replied, his voice no louder than the breath of dying stars. "They chose the cliffs instead." Above the silent earth, another council sector's beacon darkened, fading into forgotten silence. The fractures had become a flood, and the flood had no master. "Broadcast the emergency code," Karnath Salk ordered, voice stripped bare of ceremony, cracked like old stone under too many winters. "No encryption, no barriers. Earth must hear." Inside the gutted communication vault, the council's last functioning relay thrummed under failing coolant systems. The smell of overheated circuitry mixed with the dry tang of crumbling insulation, turning each breath into a scratch against the lungs. Operators hunched at their consoles, heads bowed under the failing heads-up displays flickering like dying insects against the cracked walls. The light was wrong. Thin, bruised violet bleeding from ruptured power conduits, casting long skeletal shadows across the floor. Salk approached the main terminal, the soles of his boots dragging small puffs of dust with every step. His reflection caught briefly in the fractured plasma surface. A man worn thin, eyes hollow, robes scorched from the fires outside. He activated the emergency channel, overriding all existing council permissions, with a slow, deliberate swipe across the cracked transmission slate. "This is Karnath Salk," he began, the recorder's red eye blinking once. "Former Speaker for Systems Northeast 7. By council mandate, I deliver this plea to the Terran Accord." Silence answered him, the kind that pressed into your bones and settled like winter. Elsewhere across the crumbling capital, other councilors prepared their own transmissions, isolated, ragged, disjointed. In a dimmed outpost, Vorn Drek leaned heavily on a rusted support strut, the coolness of the metal biting through his skin, anchoring him against the spinning weight of failure. "This is Vorn Drek. We seek terms. Any terms," he rasped into a portable relay clamped against his throat. "We acknowledge the breach of trust. We acknowledge." His voice faltered, collapsing into a whisper. The recorder blinked blue once. No outgoing response acknowledged. Back in the Grand Assembly's withering core, Salk pressed on. "We accept oversight. We recognize the misjudgment." His fingers tightened against the transmission panel until the casing creaked. "We recognize Earth's warning was not threat but foretelling." Overhead, another emergency star map shuddered into view. Entire sectors had simply winked out. The laser plasma lattice mapping gravitational fields now resembled a corpse with hollowed ribs. Salk kept speaking, though each word tasted like dry ash. "Humanity, we petition amnesty, a stay of total collapse, in the name of what was once shared between civilizations." His voice echoed through the half-ruined chamber, bouncing off cracked marble and iron fixtures warped by heat stress. No reply came. Only the cold whine of static threading into the marrow of every man present. On the outskirts of the assembly spire, a final transmission tower guttered under rolling blackouts. Inside the relay station, a pair of junior communicators, barely past their first diplomatic cycles, fought to maintain signal integrity. The younger of the two, breathless from sprinting across collapsing corridors, slammed his palm onto the emergency beacon console. A low pulse droned through the floor, matching the sluggish beat of his heart. He whispered into the command mic, voice raw and shaking, to any Terran listener. "We were wrong. Please. There are still children under our suns. Help us, before..." The transmission died mid-syllable as the last backup generator tore itself apart with a shriek of molten alloy. The tower fell into darkness without fanfare. Inside the ruined core of Council Central Command, Karnath Salk remained seated before the dead relay, staring at the blank feed. Operators drifted away from their posts, some pulling free shattered badges from their robes and letting them fall like discarded skin. Outside the fractured windows, the air shimmered with the fires of dying infrastructure. Supply ships, unable to stabilize orbit under shifting gravitic fields, tumbled from the sky in burning arcs. The sound, dull, low, final, reached even the thick stone foundations of the command vaults. Salk leaned forward, resting his forehead lightly against the cold console surface, inhaling the sharp chemical tang of stressed materials and something older still. The bitter scent of surrender. No words remained. No titles mattered. The Council had spoken its last into a silence older than judgment. At Terran High Command, deep in Earth's shielded core observatories, Duran Volst reviewed the incoming transmissions. The data spools fluttered across the heads-up displays like scraps of torn parchment caught in a rising storm. Fragmented pleas, broken by distance, distorted by failing technology. Each file was catalogued. Heath was archived. None were answered. Commander Yelric Dorn stood silently nearby, arms folded behind his back, watching as Earth's system simply continued its ancient, deliberate orbit, untouched by the collapse, echoing across the old trade routes. Darren keyed a quiet directive into the central console. Status: recorded, no action required. He said nothing further. The silence was not cruelty. It was judgment rendered without malice. The judgment of inevitability. Back at the council ruins, Karnath Salk finally rose. His joints crackled with the stiffness of long tension, of hopes held too long against all reason. He stepped down from the comms dais, letting his hands trail lightly along the shattered railings as he passed. An old gesture of farewell, not to colleagues, but to an era now crumbling into memory. Past the ruined colonnades, the last loyalists gathered in fragmented groups, some weeping openly, some staring numbly at the silent heavens above, where no ships answered, no reinforcements came. Karnath did not join them. He walked alone through the broken plazas, beneath skyfields flickering between twilight and chaos, the stars overhead cold and mute. At the edge of the great causeway leading into the black plains, he paused. There were no banners here, no anthems, only the hush of a world finally listening, too late. He tilted his head upward once, toward the scattered constellations now losing their anchors, and allowed himself a single, wordless thought. They warned us. Then he turned and vanished into the gathering dark. Catalogued the silent sectors, Darren Volst commanded, his voice folding into the hushed breadth of the Terran Observatory's core deck. The order moved through the command relay without fanfare, a ripple vanishing into glass and steel. Around him, the massive survey windows, reinforced beyond their era, looked out across the dark cradle of space where suns no longer burned. The scent of charged filtration systems drifted faintly beneath the sterile chill, a reminder that even Earth's breath had been engineered to survive longer than pride. Darren moved between the main heads-up displays, boots whispering across the matte floor plating, each footstep swallowed quickly by the observatory's cavernous stillness. Above the command dais, the laser plasma fields rendered a star chart now scribed with absences. Whole constellations had ruptured, leaving dark scars where once rivers of light braided through the galactic weave. The displays pulsed faint error signals, flickering between incomplete star counts and automated eulogies written in coded transmission bursts. Beside him, Commander Yelric Dorn stood like a sentinel carved from dusk, hands clasped neatly behind his back, eyes tracing the dying maps without blinking. The last sectors resist collapse by inertia alone, Dorn said after a long silence, his voice carrying no emotion, only fact. Darren nodded once, the movement barely visible beneath the dim overhead beams. His fingers slid across the relay pad, pulling a feed from a council relay station gasping its final automated status. An empty, broken signal, looping into nothing. Across the outer sectors, the collapse accelerated. Darren watched from his vantage point, a silent witness to a funeral without mourners. One feed showed a sun shedding its coronal layers into shimmering tendrils, the raw plasma spiraling away like torn silk banners, devoured by unseen tides. Another feed captured the drift of orbital cities, lights guttering, habitats spinning uncontrolled, their emergency beacons screaming futilely into space already deaf. Across a third panel, long-range telescopes caught the slow fracture of a binary systems dance, one star folding inward while its sibling twisted free, tearing away like a drowning hand losing its final grip. No interventions, no last-minute rescues, only observation. The observatory's atmosphere was different now, thick, not with tension, but with something older, quieter. The cold reek of fatigued wiring filled the air, mixing with the faint mineral tang of water vapor, condensing in corners where maintenance had shifted to survival settings. Darren adjusted the main console angle. New distress calls had flooded the emergency bands in a swelling tide, each stacking neatly on the heads-up archive, a ledger of extinction. Most messages were the same, fragmented bursts of terror, recorded confessions, desperate treaties carved in broken languages. Some cried for aid, some begged for forgiveness. None received response. Darren's eyes moved over each file without judgment. marking their passage like an archivist noting the falling of autumn leaves. He keyed the recorder. A simple action. No ceremony. Observatory log, he said, voice even, catalog entry, sectors 12, 17, 21. Status. Black. He paused, watching as 3 more sectors guttered into null spaces across the laser plasma array. Sector 24, he added quietly, in final collapse phase. The recorder chirped confirmation and filed the note under the Earth archives. Another system gone. Another echo fading. Commander Dorn approached, the muted brush of his coat catching the shallow lighting. Council command, trace signatures have ceased, Dorn said. No surviving broadcast authorities detected. Darren didn't turn. He simply tapped the console, dismissing the confirmation screens. It was never ours to save, Darren replied. The words not cold but carved from something deeper. A weariness older than conflict. He moved to the central projection dais, where Earth's planetary defenses, fleet positions, and communication nodes rotated in slow, eternal patience. Not one had needed to fire. Not one had broken protocol. Above the world they protected, the stars continued their old, slow songs. Across the observatory ceiling, a shifting mural of now-dead systems unfolded. Darren watched the last confirmed visuals. A ring city spiraling apart in silent gyres. A mining station cracking along a gravitic rift. A temple world. Its sacred suns sputtering into twilight as priests scattered prayers into the blind sky. Every image was burned into the system's storage, untouched, unjudged. A whisper of static brushed the observatory's lower bands. Another distress signal from a dead relay. The machine tagged it automatically, no response necessary. Darren drew a slow breath, the recycled air dry against his throat. Catalog complete to cycle 842.09, the system announced with clinical finality. Earth's registry had recorded it all, and would remember longer than grief allowed. Outside, over the ridgelines and oceans of the sleeping Earth, the stars seemed unchanged to the naked eye, still flickering, still weaving their ancient myths across the black. But Darren knew. Each point of light he saw might already be dead, its death cry simply not yet reaching the home world that had offered peace, and been mocked for it. He pressed his palm to the cold inner glass of the viewport. Through the touch plate, he felt the rhythmic vibration of Earth's own protective fields. Silent, strong, enduring. The galaxy might tear itself apart. Earth would endure without raising a hand. Behind him, Dorn shifted once, clearing his throat in the heavy quiet. The recorders ask if a final report should be compiled, he said. Darren closed his eyes briefly, considering. Mark it, he said, voice a thread through the immense silence. Final disposition, external civilizations lost through willful neglect. He added nothing more. There was nothing more to add. The observatory fell back into its ancient rhythms, systems cycling into passive monitoring modes, the chatter of dying empires fading beneath layers of solar data, planetary drift calculations, and deep space driftbuoy updates. In the farthest console, the heads-up archive finished cataloging the last unread message from the Council's highest surviving node. It blinked once, faded, and was gone. Earth watched. And Earth waited. The stars might break. The homeworld would remain. Seal all outbound ports, Darren Volst said, his voice low and final, as he stood before the central communications core of Earth's deep observatory station. The floor beneath him hummed with the contained power of ancient transmission arrays, their conduits threading beneath the foundation like the buried veins of some titanic sleeping beast. The air tasted of ion-scrubbed minerals, and the faint, dry bitterness of long-running cooling systems straining at the edge of silence. Across the main heads-up displays, the last distress signals flickered and stacked. Broken appeals, fading beacon signatures, fragmentary pleas gasping out from the darkness beyond Earth's reach. None of them bore weight anymore. They were relics, whispers tumbling through a graveyard too wide for answers. Commander Yelric Dorn approached, his boots striking quiet chords against the brushed steel decking. He offered no words, there was nothing left to debate. Darren keyed in a final access sequence. The room's lighting dimmed automatically, plunging the observation deck into a muted twilight where only the blood-red gleam of laser plasma consoles illuminated their figures, silhouettes carved in solemnity. The central communication relay stood open, awaiting the final input. Darren stepped closer, the faint vibration of the transmission node alive beneath his fingertips. "This," he said, speaking to no audience but the dead air, "is not vengeance." The system blinked once, recording. "It is remembrance." He brought up the transmission field, the Great Council registry, their last surviving codes, now floating adrift among the debris fields of their failed protectorates. Each line of their authority, their treaties, their declarations of dominion, flashed once across the display, before Darren swept a deletion command across them all. One by one, Council registry entries grayed out, crumbling into silent zeros. Earth's final transmission would stand alone. Darren leaned in, letting the microphone catch only the measured cadence of what must endure. "Ability was offered," he said, each syllable carved from stone and dust. "Insolence was chosen." He tapped the confirm key. The relay shuddered once as the message ignited across deep space transbands. A pulse fired outward at sublight delay, designed not for conversation but for inscription. It was not a signal sent in hope. It was a eulogy written into the bones of dying stars. The console's final indicator blinked blue, transmission complete. Across Earth's systems, diplomatic protocols aligned in synchronized closure. The ancient negotiation channels, once stretching through hundreds of civilizations, folded inward. Council communications, archived, categorized, and now sealed, were buried under Earth's sovereign data protocols, never to open again. The Council was no longer acknowledged, not as allies, not as enemies, simply as something that had existed once. Commander Dorn moved closer, his voice steady but touched by something older than regret. "Closure initiated across all external relay gates," he reported. Darren didn't immediately answer. He turned instead to the primary viewport, looking outward across Earth's night side, a vast field of dark oceans and slumbering continents, broken here and there by city lights glowing faintly under their ion shields. Above that calm sphere, the stars spread out in endless corridors. Corridors that no longer led to any surviving empire. Cold breeze stirred through the environmental systems, carrying the faint, clean scent of neutralized atmosphere. He spoke without turning. "Mark the Council's registry as silent." Dorn keyed the order in without hesitation. The last trace of the Council, an institution that had once demanded Earth's humility, blinked into absence from Earth's systems, like a dying echo crushed under the tide of time. Darren moved back toward the communication altar, allowing his fingertips to rest briefly against the hard, worn edge of the console. This station had once been built for hope, to send humanity's greetings to 100 worlds, to forge alliances across the stretch of impossible distance. Now it had delivered Earth's final truth with the weight of inevitability. There was a strange peace in that. Not triumph, not gloating, just the steady closing of a door that had remained open too long. Above him, the last laser plasma displays folded away the star maps of the outer sectors, reducing them to thin lines of data archived for historians who might someday ask how it ended. There would be no great battles recorded, no desperate heroics, just a ledger of warnings ignored and consequences fulfilled. Commander Dorn drew nearer, posture crisp in the somber quiet. He offered a simple report. "Our Council beacons have now ceased or are functionally inoperable. No remaining live diplomatic entities detected." Darren gave a slight nod. "Archive the event as per the silent response doctrine," he said. "No amendments, no footnotes." The doctrine had been crafted long ago, buried in Earth's deepest strategic treaties. A framework for the day when Earth's patience would no longer extend to warnings unheeded. A day that had now passed. The observatory system shifted into low operational standby, the activity aboard quieting to nothing more than the whisper of thermal cycles recalibrating to maintenance mode. In the final moments before leaving the deck, Dern reached to the command terminal and pressed a single glyph, an old Terran symbol meaning end of broadcast. A gentle chime acknowledged the command. In that instant, every remaining Terran transmission directed toward the outer galactic systems, civilian, diplomatic, exploratory, shuddered. Down. No more words. No more signals. The Council's memory was entombed not in bitterness, but in silence. As he exited the observatory floor, Darren Volst spoke once more, voice nearly lost to the turning of the world beneath his feet. Vague thought silence meant weakness. He paused, just beyond the threshold where the lights dimmed into nothing. I never understood it was the gravestone already laid. Then he was gone, leaving only the hush of dead stars and a world that no longer needed to ask for permission. Earth had waited long enough. Now it simply endured. Log the last dead sector, Darren Volst commanded, standing still as a monument beneath Earth's silent observatory vault. His voice moved through the cold space like a blade, slicing the stagnant air that smelled faintly of old circuitry and deep pressurized steel. Around him, the laser plasma displays dulled their fevered dance, settling into static star maps littered with black scars. A soft confirmation chime answered him, distant, almost reverent. Commander Yelric Dorn lingered near the main relay, his posture rigid, a soldier's last stance when no enemies remain. His eyes shifted across the heads-up overlays, where the final star deaths compiled into solemn registries. Each system collapsed without resistance. Darren didn't need the confirmation screens. He could feel it, the way the galaxy itself seemed to bow under unseen gravities, pulled down by the loss of so many anchors. Earth had not lifted a weapon. Earth had simply endured, and the rest had broken themselves trying to outshout the inevitable. Across what had once been the Council's dominion, silence replaced law. Stations drifted listlessly in fractured orbits, abandoned by navies that no longer existed. Dead trade routes stretched like broken bridges across the cold, scattered voids where planets spun in lonely exile. In the carved ruins of fallen capital worlds, cities lay half-crumbled under endless dusk. Stone plazas cracked wide open where gravitational tremors tore through brittle crusts. Statues toppled, their faces eroded not by war, but by neglect and the slow violence of forgotten seasons. The smell of abandonment clung everywhere. Dust, stagnant water, the iron tang of oxidized support beams left to rot under failing atmospheric domes. No rescue fleets came. No treaties were signed. No new rulers emerged. Only silence bore witness to the undoing. Inside Terran Command's high archives, the event record finalized. Rows upon rows of encrypted data entries sealed themselves behind quantum vaults, each file stamped with a singular notation. Response, offered, action, declined, outcome, terminal. The recorders did not celebrate. The analysts did not cheer. Earth's policy had always been survival, not conquest. This too was simply survival. Above the Earth, the darkened sky showed no evidence of victory or defeat. The constellations remained, flickering like distant promises, though many of their lights were already corpses, awaiting the delay of distance to reveal the truth. In the deep halls of the observatory, Darren turned from the viewing plate, his boots whispering against the floor. The cool, recycled air brushing the back of his neck as he moved. Commander Dorn followed, step steady. Ellie won't rebuild, Dorn said. Not a question, but a simple reality laid bare. Darren glanced toward the final laser plasma display, where ancient roots, once mapped prosperity and diplomacy, now resembled the cracked veins of a dying leaf. No, Darren said. Some losses are too complete for hands to repair. He paused at the archive dais, placing his palm flat against the recognition pad, letting the system register his authority one last time. Earth watches, Darren said quietly, voice low enough the relay barely caught it. But Earth does not carry ghosts. A thin pulse of acknowledgement flickered across the terminal. Protocol complete. Beyond the observatory walls, in the long empty stretches of space once filled with bustling embassies and merchant fleets, only relics remained. Drifting wrecks, whose lights flickered like false stars, Worlds with broken satellite rings, each turning a fraction slower each orbit. Recorders echoing distress signals on loops destined never to be answered. An empire's worth of memory, too proud to accept the future when it was offered. Inside the Earth archives, the final Council dossier closed with a soft hiss of magnetic seals locking. The Great Council, once the galaxy's beacon, was now a chapter, reserved for the historians, who would teach future generations what hubris cost. No flags lowered in their memory. No morning bells tolled. The stars bore silent testament. Duran stepped through the inner corridor, boots brushing traces of polished stone where the builders had carved Earth's unbroken tree into the support beams. Not a banner of dominance, but a symbol of endurance. Dorn fell into step beside him without speaking, their motions synchronized by years of shared expectation. At the exit archway, Duran paused, looking once more across the sleeping homeworld. Lights dotted the continents below like scattered embers, each representing a city that had chosen patience over arrogance, preparation over noise. People would be dying of the warning, Dorn said at last, voice carrying a weight that sank easily into the silence. Darren let the words stand for a moment, feeling their truth settle into the marrow of everything they had witnessed. He answered only once they began their descent toward the shuttle bays, the path dimly lit by maintenance strips humming quietly beneath their boots. I mistook endurance for surrender, Darren said, eyes forward. And in doing so, he added, voice growing softer still, they forgot the first lesson written into every Terran stone. Survival is not submission. The shuttle that would take them home idled quietly on the outer platform, its heads-up panels reading clear. No alarms. No intercepts. Nothing but Earth's long, steady breath beneath a sky now reclaimed by silence. Aaron allowed himself a final glance upward before boarding, a slow sweep across the dark heavens, marked not by conquest, but by survival, painted in cold, beautiful strokes. Somewhere far beyond the threshold of human sight, the ruins of fallen empires still tumbled through dying orbits, their banners long since scorched by the weight of consequences they had summoned. The last chapter had closed, and Earth, without firing a single weapon, had outlived them all.